Well, there's Becky. Hey, Becky, come on, let's go. Let's go. I'm holding seats here. He's about to start. Hop in. Hop in. Just hop in. Yeah. I managed to hold the seats for the last second. Here we go.
Is it in my notes? I'm trying to picture. You know, sometimes you walk in my book forever. Yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you all so much for coming to Alan Jackson this evening. Welcome. Just a reminder to silence your cell phones before this evening's night begins. I'm thrilled to welcome Lucas Mann this evening for a discussion to mark the publication of Lord Fear, his remarkable memoir about his brother who died of a heroin overdose at the age of 30 when Lucas was 13. Joining him tonight is the brilliant Leslie Jameson, author of the best-selling The Empathy Exams, who describes Lord Fear as a gorgeous examination of what it means to love someone once he's gone, what it means to love someone you wish, as Mann puts it so powerfully, could have felt better than he did. Mann was born in New York and received his MFA from the University of Iowa, where he was the provost's visiting writer in non-fiction. He is the author of Class A, Baseball in the Middle of Everywhere, and he teaches writing at the University of Massachusetts. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
We get to hear you read for a little bit before we talk, right? Yeah.
Yes, okay. So, I'm going to read, but just for not that long, and then Leslie and I are going to talk, and then maybe we'll all talk. But thank you so much for being here. This is wild. I grew up in New York and fled New York, and talk a lot of shit about New York since then. But to be in McNally Jackson, doing this in front of a lot of people that I really care about is, I take some of it back. Lord Fear is kind of a hard book to read from. In its structurally kind of all blends together. There aren't any chapters, and the sections sort of move into each other, and there's different snippets of my memories and other people's perspectives, and then my brother's own writing. And so I actually haven't read this part before, but I'm going to try. This picks up a little bit after we've sort of been in the memories of a woman who's called Seema in the book, who knew my brother later in his life, and they had a close relationship. And then this is her and I talking about him, and particularly talking about the way that she and he used to talk about going to Paris, potentially. Have you ever been to Paris? She asks me. I tell her I have. The first time I was young, too young to remember much. Josh was there. It was his first time in Paris too, a trip he told her about many times, 6 days of basic tourism. It was me, my mother, my father, and Josh in a little apartment that smelled like jam that my parents swapped for. I knew you were there, she says. I don't know why I asked you, I knew that. I try to hide how happy it makes me that she knew. It shouldn't be a big deal. I'm still reveling in the fact that I was spoken of. We're working together here in our memories. She asks if I remember anything at all from the trip. I do, I say, a little. All I remember is him. I tell her that, and it makes her smile like fingers are pulling her lips back at the edges. She nods, my cue. I remember buying a gargoyle in a gift shop, a monkey man with wings and fangs, bearing those fangs, crouched. I remember Josh doing an impression of a gargoyle. We were sitting on stone steps under a stone building that I only remember as old. He had his leather jacket on, or I made that part up. He was leaning over me, baring his fangs the way gargoyles do it. He was making a hissing noise like a snake, and his lips were stretched so wide that I saw the base of his teeth pushing through his gums. I was laughing. I remember sitting in the apartment, scared of the sound the radiator made when we turned the heat on. It was snowing outside, maybe. We were watching the only video available, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, dubbed in French. Josh was pretending to be Jessica Rabbit, slinking around the living room, hands caressing his own neck, lips pouted, eyes nearly closed. Bonjour, he said, and I was laughing. I remember visiting Jim Morrison's grave. I stood back and watched. He knelt among the flowers and handmade signs, the poems and rain-warped packs of Marlboros. He was crying. I had no idea who Jim Morrison was, but I liked the visuals, the ancient green of the trees, the once bright roses lying scattered. When we left, Josh said he wasn't crying out of sadness. He was instead awed by how loved the man had been, how indelible, fresh proof of his worth laid out with each arriving tour bus. Yes, Seema says when I relay the last memory. He was going to take me to the grave. That was very important. He had a poet's soul. I don't cringe at the phrase, though I feel a tug to do so. Poet's soul. On the way back from the grave, he put his headphones on me and played Backdoor Man on cassette. I don't tell her that part. A decade has passed. She is dressed for this occasion. Everything on her is starched, black slacks, white blouse, unbuttoned argyle cardigan. Her hair is pulled into a bun, and I look at her neck, its sloped sides. This is job interview attire, clothing you can't breathe in. I wonder if she works in an office now. I don't ask. She has told me almost nothing about her present, only that she has a daughter, and she looked guilty when she showed me a wallet picture, a kid on class photo day. I can't think of anything else to say about it. A decade has passed since she knew my brother. Most of her life in America has been spent without him, and so much can change for a person who seeks change. Seema is forward momentum personified. I know that without even filling in the details. I don't want to think about what she has accomplished since he finally couldn't manage breathing. I have a suspicion that if I prodded her through her modesty, I would get to a tale of Employee of the Month plaques, incremental promotions, night school, the kind of resolute working motherhood referred to with folksy admiration at the beginning of politicians' speeches. But I don't want to ask for the specifics of how she thrived without him. I only want to know what she lost. I ask if she has ever been to Paris, because I know she'll say no. That was for us, she says. It's expensive, and it takes time. That was a place for him to show me. Paris was his promise to me. Promise is as generous a word as poet. What is a promise that is made without the chance of coming true, other than a lie? I will take you. I will be better. We will be together. There is a place, Paris, that's far from here, and lights glow off the river like lanterns floating into the sky. You didn't believe him, did you? I say. There's an undeniable scoff in my voice. I feel cruel. She half smiles without showing her teeth and tilts her face down. I'm sorry, I say. I didn't believe that we would go, she says, with quiet emphasis. But I believed in him. I believed that he thought we would. He was not a liar. He was a dreamer. He was an addict. Maybe the difference is just semantic. After talking with Seema, every time I revisit his writing, I will think of her. because no matter what notebook I pick up, as I flip through pages of detox journals and poems and lists of self-affirmations, so many reasons, so many versions of the reasons to get clean heading, I will see the word Paris appear, punctuating his thoughts, a refrain that never ends. Loose leaf, October 1988, reasons. Because it is harder every time. Get your body back. It is either success or this. I can do 3 days. It's just 3 fucking days. A week. I can do a week. Remember, Paris in January. Loose leaf, undated, untitled. What I mean is that I will not lose because I can't. The main thing is that I have an agreement with myself that if I have the methadone, I will succeed. They will be in tandem, my methadone and my inspiration. They will not compete. Accomplished men say, I couldn't have done this without my wife, etc. Same thing. In 2 months, I will be in Paris at night. 2 months, Paris. I see the word repeated at the end of a sentence, Paris, 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 Paris. Or it's capitalized, Paris, towering over all the little words around it. Or it's the last word written for a while, butted up against blank lines until finally lucidity returns and he begins again with, I was gone too long. Coming at the end of sentences, paragraphs, lists, it is often scribbled loosely, and I imagine a hand beginning to let go before the panic or the high, mostly the high, swallows all language. Comforting feels like the wrong word, but yes, it's comforting to think of him rushing to write Paris, to put it in pen, unerasable, before the nod takes over, the same way he managed to say it to her on the phone before the line went silent. And Paris itself, what he knew of it, was the perfect word to say, a place ideal and far away, just real enough to be a good hypothetical, a place that can exist in collective cultural imagination, free of urban sprawl and supermarkets and traffic congestion, just lights and river, the Eiffel Tower, good bread. A place to love and make art. I like to think that above all, that's what he wanted to do. In college, I traveled to Paris with Sophia, and we watched children push miniature scooters in the pond where everyone watches children do that. I was running out of my parents' money, so we pretended to be the kind of kids who had to worry about such things, bought a single fresh baguette in the morning, ripped off hunks all day as we walked until we were lost, talked about how we needed nothing more than this. It was exactly as those moments in life are supposed to be, better than the moments around them, indulgent, brief, Facebook-logged, then mostly forgotten. I read Hemingway, of course, and got really into that whole possessive thing. You belong to me, and all of Paris belongs to me, and I belong to this notebook and this pencil. I read Baldwin's Paris writing too, and I loved the swirling emotion, relief, guilt, longing. My flight had been dictated by my hope that I could find myself in a place where I would be treated more humanely, where my risks would be more personal, and my fate less austerely sealed. And Paris had done this for me, by leaving me completely alone. Baldwin showed up in Paris on the run, wanting to be somebody without history. In Paris, its specifics didn't matter, only that Paris was not the place he was running from. I saw Josh in cafes when I read Baldwin, anonymous to everyone but me, reborn clean. If there was any place for there to remain an ember of him, the promise of his life still pulsing orange, finally free from all back home that had tried to stamp him out, this was it. Of course it was a stretch to find him in Baldwin, because Baldwin was running from hatred and oppression, from unavoidable violence crashing in on him. Addiction is a very self-imposed brand of oppression, but still, it's better to think of the addict as oppressed than wallowing. Oppression doesn't carry inward blame. That has always been the hardest part of remembering, the effort not to blame. I feel that he is alive now still, Seema tells me. She leans across the table and her hands almost touch mine. His spirit, I mean. He's watching us. I believe that. I say nothing, so she says, maybe I sound cuckoo. It's not a question that I want to answer, because yes, she does. I am not a believer. I was not raised for that. Neither was he, but I think he wanted to believe. And in the end, he had to believe. There isn't a language of addiction that takes atheism into account. The NA meetings that he quit, the Al-Anon groups that my father later tried to find solace in, both required a relinquishing of control to that higher power that wants what is best for us. And really to believe what an addict tells himself, requires a predisposition for, or at least some experience in, faith. All you have seen is deterioration, but you are being promised regeneration, asked to trust that there remains some divinity, And despite how wholly unbelievable that is, you must believe. There's a reason why Seema was his last friend, the last he made and the last to stick around. Why she is the only person I've found who knew him only as an addict. She never got to hear him play music. She never read his words. She never saw the muscle lines that ran like shadows across his torso. She only knew a man afflicted, making promises. Even that first time he spoke to her in Hindi in a sandwich shop on 26th Street, she knew something was wrong. He was waiting to be redeemed, and she never let herself say that it wouldn't happen. What a sap, I want to think, believing in the unproven and the unlikely. No, I hear myself say. Not cuckoo at all. I talk to him sometimes, she says. I smell him like he's sitting down next to me. Do you remember how he smelled? I remember how he smelled and how he spoke to me. Sometimes I speak back. There's another Baldwin piece I love, and it has nothing to do with Paris. Sonny's Blues is about a Harlem man with a junkie jazz musician brother. It's about trying to listen. There's a scene where the brother is at the piano playing, striving to make the narrator understand. Finally, for a moment, he does. Baldwin writes, "While the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness." Josh is still speaking to Seema because that's what an addict is always trying to do, trying to tell you. Tonight, in Queens, in an apartment with barred windows and a steep mortgage, where there are no pictures of him, he will speak. Tonight, in a quiet, candlelit bedroom, he will tell her, and she will listen, his voice filling her as she watches her daughter, a smiling child who has never done anything wrong, who likes to dance on the bed in her mother's skirts. Thank you.
That was really, really beautiful.
Thanks.
I've spent some time with this book, but it really is a different and powerful thing to hear you read it. So,
Thanks.
I thought when I was thinking about how to start things off tonight, I wanted to pull back for a second and just say it really is a remarkable book you've written, and for me, I was sort of moved by it on a human level, and also really thinking hard about it as a writer and in terms of the craft of these three elements. I mean, more than three, but these three sort of ways that you construct the story. And you alluded a bit in the beginning, but in addition to drawing on your own memories, you also draw quite a bit on Josh's journals and other kinds of archives he left behind, recordings, and these kind of these fragments, like actual pieces of him. And then there's this third element, which is all these interviews you did with people who knew him. And I wanted to talk about how those three elements, the kind of reported parts of it, the memory parts of it, and in a way, like the kind of archival research of it. I mean, it's deeply personal archival research, but how those parts of the process work together, and also whether when you started the process, you imagined all of those being involved, or whether you sort of realized at a certain point that interviews were going to be a part of it, or whether they were all there from the start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the interviews were the first thing. I mean, it started from a really journalistic perspective, and it started from, I want to tell his story, and I'm gonna, go and try to do the work to find people to ask these questions, and then kind of lay these interviews out. And the interviews were rendered pretty much like in scene as interviews, sort of I said and they said. And then a lot of the process of developing it became allowing it to get sort of stranger and more impressionistic, and allowing these interviews to sort of develop into these kind of imagined, reconstructed scenes. And then there was sort of the balancing of how much of myself I wanted to be in there, and me as a narrator sort of being necessary, but trying to keep it as myself and what I was thinking about him and what I was feeling about him, being kind of a vessel for his story, or the sort of ideas that his story brings up. And then the archival stuff, which I think is a good way to put it, that his writing was the last thing that came in. And it's stuff that I had and I think found various excuses to not put it in for many drafts. And then once sort of trying to play around with it and accepting that it was missing something without his voice in there, then that kind of became the catalyst that made it take off into its ultimate form. And I could sort of like just write copy down a piece of what he wrote in a Word document and sort of look at it and take the other stuff that I had written and kind of just sort of place it down in the middle of a couple things, and all of a sudden everything else begin to move in orbit of that and take new meaning out of that. So that was like the last thing that made it come together.
Yeah, well, in a way, that's really interesting because some of my other questions were about how you structured it, because as you said in the beginning, and I can't imagine it would be hard to choose one discrete section to read, because there's a feeling of it being this like stream, and you just sort of dip into it, but it feels very continuous and fluid. And I guess because it's not chronologically organized, and you start with his funeral and end with a really moving, just a memory plucked from part of your relationship with him of a night that he was sitting for you and was in this bath and was articulating being in pain. But I'm wondering sort of if you could have got rid of chronology as the organizing principle, like how you decided what pieces went where and whether you sort of wanted there to be an arc across the book and what that you wanted that arc to be.
Yeah, I think, part of the distance that happened between when I started writing it and then when I was able to come back to it for a last draft was so great that any sort of feeling of immediate chronology was just just felt like bullshit.
Yeah.
And then it became sort of, I guess, creating an arc out of a lot of these experiences that happened in quick succession to each other, but letting the thought process connect between the two of them, or letting two people's voices that seem totally different in terms of what they saw about him, and you throw some of his writing in there that is then a different perspective on it, and then it kind of serves. I guess I was sort of thinking about them as kind of like trapdoors falling into one another, and it kind of became like a collage piece in that way.
Well, and it's such a great way of putting it, this idea of trapdoors. Because sometimes I think what can be so pleasurable for a reader in a piece of writing is sort of feeling like the scope of this thing or this scene or this relationship, and then something opens up and you like fall down to the next level and realize that it was actually so much more or so different than you had thought, and that can be such a powerful sort of disorientation. And when you talk about the way that Josh's writing became such a crucial, not just like emotional component of it, but really like organizing component of it, it does strike me that there's a way that all these interviews leave, one senses you, the narrator, but also us, the readers, like hungry for this absent center, and that part of what, including his fragments of his voices, is just give us some feeling of contact with that.
Yeah, and particularly, I didn't want any of the interviews or the material written off of the interviews to serve as like, the story, right? And I wanted the idea to kind of be that everybody was trying to make sense out of this thing. Everybody continues to try to find meaning and remember things they want, or remember things the way that they want to or need to. But to have that there without the act of also being like, this was the way that he tried to tell his story, and that is as incomplete as the ways that other people did, but very, very valid. Sort of shifting mentally to think about it that way as sort of a series of attempts, and how sincere and how valid his attempts were. It was sort of like, if I should have thought of this 5 years ago.
Yeah, but that idea that in a way all of them are linked by the fact that none of them are complete. I mean, that all of them are do feel infused with this spirit of attempt and constant attempt and attempt like over and over again. I felt one of the big things I wanted to ask you about was just the process of these interviews and like the emotional dynamics of the interviews. And at one point you have this quote pretty early on where you talk about, you're talking about your life or sort of mode as a reporter, like even before this project. You say, mine is a simple-minded, mission-driven, bleeding heart kind of reporting. I interview people I deem sad or undeserved, which I both kind of identified. Bleeding heart reporting should be its own professional category, but the sense that sort of your reporting style was already like really emotionally suffused with emotion, but that these interviews were obviously drawing on a different kind, and I'm just wondering sort of how that felt to you to move from interviewing strangers or people who at least started out as strangers to interviewing people, some of whom you already had a relationship with, others with which you didn't, but you had this huge figure in common.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the distance and the length that it took ended up being really crucial in a way that I don't think I realized, because I think, originally the writing, the first drafts of the writing were tied to the sort of emotional immediacy of those interviews. And they were, right? I mean, there was no way for them to not be, you go into this with sort of like your questions, and like, I feel like I was, trying to be removed and professional, and then it sort of very quickly devolved into what it needed to devolve into, these huge emotional stakes for everybody involved. And so I think it was trying to like balance those modes immediately afterwards or close to it was difficult. And then part of having this distance and going back and continuously rewriting is that it almost kind of became like, in some ways, like a memoir of the process of trying to write it the first time, unintentionally. And so there was enough remove to be able to be like, this was the moment that I was interacting, and this was that interview, and then actually, in retrospect, this is what has lasted of that interview. This is how those thoughts and those emotions have developed, and that's what I was feeling then, and that being sort of part of the story. To be able to get a little distance on the act of it. I think in earlier drafts, in a lot of ways, the book was sort of about the act of it, without it being intentionally so, but it just overwhelmed it, the intensity of each of those interactions.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, remembering becomes a verb in this book in such a powerful way, and that active kind of collaborative remembering that happens in interviews, it's like collaborative but also fraught. I mean, some of the most interesting moments for me are moments where, perhaps because of that distance, you're able to articulate that your desires were, you wanted something more from the person you were interviewing than they wanted to give, and that comes alive in a really compelling way too. And
and I think that, I think earlier on it was hard to get rid of a sense of the immediate feeling of like, fuck this person, like that. These were angry interactions in some way.
Something
and so then to be able to write through drafts and think about it, and then the ways that those situations were my fault, my complicity, being able to be like, these were my expectations, this is how it went wrong, instead of just, this is a sad conversation that I felt really sad, and this is an angry conversation that I felt really angry, and I don't think early on I was able to do that in any kind of effective way.
Yeah. I could keep asking you questions all day, which maybe I will, but I also want to give other people, many of whom I'm sure have questions as well, a chance to ask them, so I'm going to open it up.
I'm going to ask you a very simple, straightforward question. How old were you when you started writing this?
21 and 22. And so it's been, 7 years.
So you weren't really that far, so...
I weirdly, and I just realized this, I think the distance between his death and when I tried to start writing it, and then the distance between when I tried to start writing it and now are close to equidistant.
That's right.
I have no idea if that is significant in any way, but it's something that just dawned on me recently. So there was, talking about these levels of remove, there was just to be able to get to a place to think about writing about it was its own level of remove, and then to be able to get to a place to think about handling that process in any kind of thoughtful way was, another one.
Well, I think it also would be a kind of paradox, because the attempt to remove was also the desire to go toward. In other words, to write, to resolve, to figure out.
Yeah.
So it's,
And I think that early on, that desire to resolve or that desire to figure out, was there the whole point. And then I think a lot of that process, I think early on it came out of I'm going to figure this out, and when I figure it out, I will tell you. And then it sort of developed into being about that attempt to figure it out. And we're saying the word attempt over and over again, but that these sort of fits and starts and being about trying. I think that had to happen with enough distance to be able to look back and see the flawed or fraught processes that went into even trying to do it in the first place.
It seems like it's been such an ongoing, organic, searching kind of process for you, and I wonder what it feels like to actually have a book bound and published with a neat cover. Does it truncate the process? Do you think you'd like to add chapters at some point?
No. I mean, something that sort of ended up being helpful in the process too is that I was working on this and then giving up and working on it and giving up, and then I set it aside for the most part in graduate school and wrote this book about minor league baseball, which is like, I think writing that and going through a lot of the processes of I want to put this into a book, I want to put this into a book, and this sort of like reaching sense of that being a first book. Then when I did that and I felt like, okay, I feel like I understand that experience of trying to write a book, there was a point when I came back to this one and was like, I'm going to give this another legitimate shot, where there was a thought process of either I start from this point and keep trying to push outwards as much as possible, right? Like now I'm at a point where I can do so many more interviews, and I'm a better interviewer, I'm a different writer, and I can go here and I can go there. And there was I made a conscious decision of, I want this to be as tightened as possible. And so, it kind of feels like in doing that, both from a writing standpoint and also from just sort of a thinking about it standpoint, it did kind of truncate that into a very particular line of inquiry and set of experiences that I'm always sort of going to think about and turn over and all that. But it was really helpful, writing-wise and personal-wise, to just be like, this is the scope, and the thought process is going to be dealing with all of the fraught things within the scope, instead of, well, now I can check on this, or now I can bring in, a bunch of research about the nature of addiction, and now, it was, I'm happy with that decision.
If it's not too personal, you said that you were reluctant or you found it difficult to use the archival material.
Yeah.
But the fact that there is that archival material, to me, makes the book that much greater. What was the hesitance in not seeing its value, or in being reluctant to go there?
I think it was just. I think it was just emotional and intellectual laziness at the same time. I think I was like. There were just piles and piles of notebooks and letters, and it was going to be an enormous thing that I think would re-bring a lot of emotional immediacy in for me, and I knew that, and then would also potentially complicate and add enormous things to the narrative, and both of those things happened. And I think I was just trying to find ways to be like, that's not right, it doesn't need that. For no good reason other than avoiding it.
Because the trapdoor works.
You're right, yeah.
What are some of the big ways, or some of the ways that it got complicated, the story you told?
I think just having, it's writing about people is weird.
Yeah.
And writing about, talking to all these people and then thinking myself and writing about someone as an absence. That's in a lot of ways what the project was, but then the more I was doing it and the more I was working on it, the absence becomes acute, and the things that I would think or remember, the things that other people would say, for so many drafts and so many years of thinking about it, didn't have to butt up against what he was trying to do, how he wanted to say it, and the stakes that that he had in trying to express what he was feeling and what he was trying to do. And so it's just everything. Everything became weighted by that, or moving off of that, as opposed to moving away from his voice as sort of speaking into this blank space where you could say whatever. Yeah.
Have you noticed any themes or like commonalities in terms of reader response? Have you gotten that opportunity?
I don't know. No, people picking out like the moments that stand out as particularly like harrowing or disturbing to people have consistently been moments where I was like, that one? Been a couple of specific mentions of the way that a cat is treated, which, I mean, there's a lot of difficult stuff in the book, and not to poo-poo the cat, but I mean, it just, I guess, just sort of, it's one of these things that it sort of, people have seemed to sort of consistently take intense reactions to particular moments out of it that I have not had any handle on at all, or didn't expect at all. So, I mean, I guess the only commonality has been just sort of a general sense of like, oh wow, okay, this stuck out to somebody. Asher.
What was it like writing sort of critically and honestly about the rest of your family, father and brother?
I don't know. I mean, it's a pretty flawed line of work. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I don't think there's any way to like think about it that makes you be like, no, that's cool. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think it in some ways feels like an act of betrayal over and over and over again. And honestly, I think it's felt that way about writing about anybody in more journalistic settings, more personal settings. I mean, I think it's been helpful that they've been really cool. But I don't know, I don't have any kind of good answer for that other than it still feels gross in some ways.
I have not read the book, so I only know what you read, which is beautiful. And I'm guessing that something that must come through hugely in the book, this is guessing, is a conflict between love and hate of your brother. And you, as I understand, there was 17 years between the two of you?
A little more, yeah.
What made you care so much about him? I mean, probably most people here have sometimes cared about someone who is addicted, but so what made you, here's this brother, 17 years older, you know, he's addicted, it's difficult, what made you care so much?
I think, I mean, I don't know about love and hate as much as sort of love and anger, or, you know, understanding and then lack of understanding. I think the book was kind of born out of a very particular perspective of, you know, I was 13 when he died, so the experiences that I had were very much in the realm of intense, you know, you feel things very deeply as a child. So it was kind of, the care was coming out of a place of mythology in a lot of ways. And I think that was, I don't think that I would write a book or be interested in or know how to write a book that was from like, these are a set of experiences that I feel I understand very well that meant a lot to me, and I'm going to relay those to you. So this came out of, I felt like I was old enough and knew enough to care deeply about this person and like feel the sort of mystery of them, the sort of larger than life quality. And then it ended before any sort of more subtlety could grow into it. So I think I was kind of, that was the perspective that I was left with, was one of just sort of enormous feeling and not much knowledge. And so the book kind of moved organically from that place. Sean?
Two questions. One, how did you choose the pseudonyms? Did you get to pick? Like, have any of like the tertiary people you've interviewed, like, are they
Yeah. Everybody, the pseudonyms were not particularly well done, and I don't think nobody really had. Pete got to veto his originally. Beyond that, no, it just sort of felt like this weird. Okay. It was I wanted it to sort of like rhythmically line up, but it was a weird thing. And then everybody involved. I think everybody had read either the whole thing or the sections that directly related to them, and I had phone conversations with everybody or personal conversations, just sort of being like, that was important to me to make sure that those conversations were at least had, and there was the option if somebody was like, this feels not right, or this feels like not something that I think should be there, that it could be changed. That happens.
Did that end up being a sort of substantive stage of editing and sort of incorporating people's reactions to their portions of the book, or were people pretty hands-off?
Probably not. There was a lot of, there were like really good conversations that were born out of it, but by and large there was an incredible amount of just sort of like thoughtfulness and generosity and acceptance, which again I was sort of amazed to have with my first book as well, with people that I didn't know. I was kind of amazed at how fruitful and non-combative a lot of the conversations were.
Yeah, it is. I think it is a part of. I haven't written very much about my family, but it's like there's this even more hours of my life went into conversations with my family about what their feelings about what had been written in the actual writing itself. So it becomes this other sort of labor that happens.
It's like its own project.
Having read both of your books, I think one of the things that makes them work so well is that although it can be tough on the other people who are interviewed, you're so honest about yourself and there's so much self-revelation that the balance is really beautiful and feels so authentic. And I know that the books are on very different topics, but they're a pure form of memoir because I really feel that I understand where you're coming from.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's something that you do really well, Leslie, and I think that typifies a kind of writing of, when the research and when you reach outside of yourself, kind of meeting that with hopefully not necessarily, this is about me now, but at least sort of being able to be willing to sort of say, here's my shit. Maybe be more willing to do that than you are with other people. Just from sort of that's always been the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. And then I think from like a really sort of crass narrative standpoint, I think it works. Like it buys you goodwill. I don't know. I remember reading David Foster Wallace and being like, oh, he says really mean things about everybody, and then he says he's sweating a lot, and like. He does more than that, but it balances, right? I mean, it's sort of, instead of being like, I'm omniscient, I have things to say, I have judgments to make, it's this kind of really, hopefully interesting to read negotiation between everybody's stakes being out there and your own stakes being out there, and those things kind of swirling around each other.
When so much of this book, is driven by a kind of curiosity that constantly takes you outside of yourself and outside of your own emotional experience, but the whole thing feels so just saturated with your investment in these beautiful ways. And even the part that you read where you talk about these very small details that resonate so much, like how much it meant to you that Josh had told Seema that you were in Paris with him. And like when I read that, like I feel so involved in the story you're telling and what it means to you to be telling it. So it's those ways that I feel like involving yourself or the stakes for you they're not like in competition with letting the narrative belong to him in some way. They're absolutely entwined with it. So.
Oh, thanks. And I think that the idea of like not being in competition is a good way to put it, right? I think when people talk about nonfiction a lot, there's you separate the journalistic and you separate the personal, and the two are kind of at odds or not overlapping, and then the kind of writing that I'm drawn to, they're complicating each other as opposed to conflicting with each other or drowning each other out.
I haven't read the book, Jeff, but just know what you've read, and I was very touched by from the beginning, and then the poignancy of bringing Baldwin in and hearing, this is an exercise in hearing his brother. I mean, it just kind of, it's like culminated all of your feelings and the parallel to him, and it was just so, I thought, an incredible way of heightening your feeling through using that as an example.
Thanks. That's another. I mean, that is sort of consciously there in the book a lot. There's a bunch of literary references. Kind of stabs in a lot of different directions. But that just sort of ultimately felt organic to this particular story, but also just sort of the way that I like to write or read or think, or just sort of think of the essay or creative nonfiction as this kind of grab bag of reaching in a bunch of different directions to try to think more about something or feel more about something. The literary references were, really helpful for me, honestly, in terms of writing it.
When you decided to use Jocke's writing, was that also when you decided to use other literary references, or were the literary references there before?
There had been some, and then I'd taken some out, and then, that was sort of a back and forth that I was...
It almost felt like having his writing there allowed you to...
they kind of all sort of rushed together at this moment of sort of like, well, now the kitchen sink is going in, or just sort of freeing up to be like, all right, if I'm at a point where I can think of the scope of this in terms of the different ways to move being all of these other things, then take a shot at them and see if it helps, and then they all kind of helped very quickly.
Any last questions?
Hi, Keisha.
People are everywhere in the store. I love it. They filled every available corner.
You talked about how you were writing this all writing this all along because from a point of view you wanted to understand, now you're understanding. And I wondered the answer to the question of, do you feel like you now have a greater understanding of your brother and a sense of some sort of ease and closure, like how do you feel now about the whole thing? Or do you feel like you're the same thing?
I don't necessarily know that I feel like I have a greater understanding or a sense of sort of easy completion or in that way. But I think maybe it sort of coalesced into putting more, I guess, making the focus being the act of thinking about it, the act of memorializing, the act of trying to understand and make sense out of things, and then all of the other people featured in that, engaging in that same activity. And so I think a lot of the process became kind of accepting that it wasn't going to be about any feeling of clear closure, but more about the, hopefully validity, whether it's emotional or from a writing standpoint or whatever, of people trying to do that work over and over again and trying to tell stories about something they've lost, trying to think about them, trying to keep remembering. I think that was kind of an unexpected resolution in that it wasn't a pointed one, that it just kind of laid out on a continuum more.
I'm going to make two quick statements. There is no way that death does not bring with it an enormous amount of mystery and raise questions. That's one. And two, the very nature of Lord Fear is an homage. So that's what we have done as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks.
Did any of the earlier drafts of the book have chapters, and how were you trying to lay everything out, and when did you decide to shift it into this kind of
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think originally it did, and sort of each, the interviews were written more sort of straight journalistically, and they were each sort of like their own section that came with like, these were the interactions, this was me entering the interaction, this was me leaving the interaction, this was me reflecting on it. And then there were sort of like, well, the personal needs to be in here, so there was like separate personal chapters that in a lot of ways were just going in wildly the wrong direction of just like, you know, yeah. And so yeah, and a lot of it was sort of elongating things, trying to drag everything out, and then trying to make each thing its own cohesive unit. And so then yeah, the process at the end became just cutting a ton of stuff and trying to strip it down as bare bones as possible, and in doing that, letting the separation between chapters go as well.
Made me feel like I couldn't put it down. Literally.
Thanks.
But I just had to keep reading. You know.
Thanks.
It was incredible to hear you read it and talk about it. I think you will be signing
I think so.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks all for coming out.
Thanks.